Good morning, everyone. How are you?
Hello.
Doing well. So as Wayne said, my name is Mary Grove, and I'm the director of Google for Entrepreneurs. Our team endeavors to bring the best of Google resources to support startup ecosystems in over 140 countries, and we are a very proud presenting sponsor of Tech Inclusion. It's my pleasure to welcome today to Tech Inclusion one of the most entrepreneurial leaders I know, Obi Felton. Obi is the leader of early stage projects at X, the team behind self-driving cars and internet from balloons. Previously, she was the director of consumer marketing for Google in Europe, Middle East, and Africa. Before Google, Obi launched e-commerce businesses and worked as a strategy consultant. She is a startup angel investor focused on investing in female-led companies. Obi is on the board of Shift, a charity, and Picasso Labs, a tech startup. She grew up in Berlin, went to Oxford University, and she now lives here in San Francisco with her husband and her young children. Please join me in welcoming Obi Felton.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here with us. So Obi, your title is absolutely awesome. It is Head of Getting Moonshots Ready for Contact with the Real World. So tell us a little bit about what happens at X, what specifically you oversee, and how do you define a moonshot?
Okay. So at X, we aim to solve large problems in the world with breakthrough technology. And our definition, we call ourselves a moonshot factory. And our definition of a moonshot is that we take a large problem in the world, something that if we solved it would affect millions or billions of people, and we work on a radical solution that sounds like science fiction today, but we think that there's a breakthrough technology that we can bring about within the next 5 or 10 years that will actually make that solution reality. So it's really a little bit about turning science fiction into real science and real tech. Self-driving cars was the project that founded the group, and now we work on a whole bunch of different projects, including Project Loon, which is internet from balloon. What if you could give the whole world access through a floating network of stratospheric balloons? And I run a group called Foundry, which is the early stage project. So when we first start building a team around an idea, we de-risk the technology, but we also start thinking about how could we one day turn this into a product or business.
So how would you define the culture at X?
Oh, I didn't answer the question about my title, so why I have that funny title. So it's partly because that's what we do in Foundry, right? So it's like taking the tech out into the real world, and we talk a lot about making contact with the real world early. So that means sometimes taking it out to end users and testing it out, even when it's still not working properly yet. And I also got the title because I was one of the first non-scientists, non-engineers. So when I first joined the team, that was actually my point of difference was, yes, I was a woman and there weren't that many women in the team at the time either, but I felt most other because I was not an engineer. And I had to do everything that wasn't the engineering, so de-risk everything that wasn't the tech. So the culture at X is, I would say it shifts over time because we're an evolving team. There's always new teams starting and teams going out, but there's a few values that are definitely sort of staying. One of them is around audacity. Like the problems we tackle are really big, the technology we work on is really crazy, and so you have to have a certain level of just going for it and believing that it can be done, possibly even irrationally so. With that level of audacity, there comes a certain amount of failure. So we work very hard to make it a place where it's safe to fail. And then the third value that really is important to me is creativity, of kind of tackling problems in a different way. So not necessarily doing the things that everyone else has tried already, because then you're just sort of treading in their footsteps, and it's very hard to do it, but having like a shift of perspective.
So on that point of failure, and you grew up in Europe, I've read in one of your Medium posts, you said that it's actually a bit of a cliche that Silicon Valley is better at embracing failure than Europe is. Talk to me about this a little bit, and how do you think about failure in your own work at X?
Yeah. So I grew up in Europe, and in Europe, like traditionally, failure is definitely something to be afraid of. If you go bankrupt, that's a bad thing. And when I came here, I idea of Silicon Valley as this place where even people who fail become heroes. And that's clearly just not true, right? Like, everyone here still strives for success, and every entrepreneur always tells you that their startup is going great, and every VC always tells you that they've invested in the latest Google or Facebook or WhatsApp or whatever, right? And people find it just as hard to be honest about things that are not going super well. What I do see here, though, is like a greater resilience and ability to deal with the failure. And at X, we've done quite a lot of thinking about that, just because, you know, of the projects that start in my group, the majority of them fail. So it's kind of built into the system. So I'd have 3 tips for how to deal with failure in a graceful way. So the first one is treating failure as a learning opportunity, which is also kind of a cliche, but it's very real, I think. And so the first thing is that we want to find out as quickly as possible if something is not going to work. So Astro, Taylor, who runs X, he's my boss, he coined this idea of working on the monkey and the pedestal. So imagine you want to teach a monkey to recite Shakespeare's sonnets while standing on a pedestal. What do you work on first, training the monkey or building the pedestal? And it's very tempting to first, like when you make your list of things that you need to get done, to work on the things that you know you can do, right? Because you sort of tick them off your to-do list and you feel like you're making some progress and it feels good. And you can go back to your investors and you can say, yes, look at all the amazing things we've done. But the point about the monkey is, like, what if you then, in your second year, hit the real problem, the thing that you can't solve, right? You find out that the monkey can't be trained. So you've got this beautiful pedestal, which is completely useless. So when we start a project, I ask the team to make a list of all the things that would actually be the biggest risks to the project, and then I ask them to work on those first, which is very counterintuitive. It's hard to do, but I recommend it. So that's the first thing, work on the hardest things first. The second thing is most people set success criteria for their projects or their prototypes or their idea realization, and we also set kill criteria. So when do we know that this prototype is going to fail? Like, when do we know that this project's not going to go forward? And what happens if you set that up front, then the team can actually make the decision themselves. So we had this beautiful project called Foghorn, which was about making renewable fuel from seawater by extracting CO2 from seawater. And one of the goals, many of the goals were technical, and one of the goals was a business goal that it had to be as cheap as conventional fuel. So when the oil price tanked, the team came to me and said, we've hit our kill criteria because this can no longer be a viable product. And for that, I gave them a spot bonus. They did a long post-mortem and presented to all of X, and they also, 2 of the people got promoted. So that's another tip that I would have for leaders and companies, is like, you need to decouple project failure from like personal progress. Like, someone can make great personal progress, and even if the project fails, because otherwise nobody wants to work on that really risky thing that may not go well. And then the final thing is that we've learned that there's always an emotional cost, and we now have a celebration where we grieve. So on the 1st of November, we celebrate Dia de los Muertos. It was an idea from 2 Latinas in my team, and they said we need to have this celebration. So we have like a traditional Day of the Dead celebration with an altar, with drummers, with dancers, where people sort of bring artifacts of things that have failed, but they also often bring personal stories, you know, like a parent who died, for instance, and they bring it, and the ceremony is basically a celebration of death and life and of moving on.
I love it. 3 very tangible pieces of feedback. So Obi, you and I have worked together for years at Google. One of the things I've always admired most about you is what a champion you are for diversity and inclusion within the company more broadly, within the teams you run. So can you talk to us about what measures you're taking actively every day as a leader to promote an environment of diversity and inclusion within X, within your team as well?
Right. So because of what we work on, like the moonshots, like diversity is like an imperative for us, because, you know, we work on global problems. We work on things that take us far beyond the valley, right? Like we don't work on like juice machines for rich people in the valley. So we need to understand our users. So that's like the first thing. We have people from all over the world with very different backgrounds. You know, one of our engineers grew up in a fishing village in the Philippines and was like the primary breadwinner for his family, going fishing for the first part of his career. And so we bring together very multidisciplinary teams. So on Loon, for instance, you know, we have many engineers, but we also have a former seamstress and fashion designer, and she became the test engineer because it turned out that her understanding of fabric was super helpful in understanding of why we were having all these leaks in balloons that caused them to come down from the stratosphere. So that would be the first thing. So we have a probably much wider definition of diversity. It's not sort of just along traditional gender or ethnic lines, although we do have programs specifically to develop women, for instance. We want to ultimately get to a point where we could measure cognitive diversity. So it's much more about diversity of thinking that cuts across these sort of traditional definitions. So yes, I want to hire more women, and yes, we do things to develop them specifically, but it's a sort of broader thought than that.
On the topic of women specifically, you recently wrote a post that went quite viral. The hashtag was diversity moonshots.
Yes.
Can you tell us all the title of the post and a bit of your thinking behind it?
Yeah, so the title of my post, it's on LinkedIn if you want to look it up, is Yes, Silicon Valley is still awful for women, especially female founders. And I was paying homage to an Atlantic article that came out earlier this year, which mostly was talking about the corporate world. But although I work in the corporate world, I do a lot of work with startups. That's how sort of Mary and I first worked together when I was in Europe. And after I moved to the Valley, I sort of shifted my focus from mentoring startup founders generally to just mentoring women. And that's because it sucks so much to be a female founder in this place. The numbers are extraordinary, right? It's still 17% of all founders are women. And the funding is even worse. It's less than 10%. I mean, I think the lowest number I found was 2%. The most generous interpretation was Crunchbase's, which added up to about 9.6%. And so I got interested in, what are the reasons? And I've been talking to a lot of founders over the last 5 years. Part of it is just the network, that the women are less plugged in. Part of it is the funding mechanisms, that most of the money is controlled by white men. And that even when you have a single female partner in a firm, they have a tough time. I think Ellen Power's up after us, and I'm sure we'll touch on that. And so even the female partners in the VC firms, if they're the only one, don't necessarily fund more women. It's because I think they feel weird bringing a female deal to the table. So the whole system is basically broken. And I think the women in the system are succeeding despite it, not because of it. And part of the survival mechanism that I found when I came to the Valley was to join women's groups, and women's networks. And there's all these sort of groups that have sprung up. But increasingly, there's also sort of alternative funding methods. And one of the founders that I worked with over the last 5 years, I actually met her at Women 2.0, another inclusion conference. And she's called Janica Alvarez, and she works on a smart breast pump. And so she had lots of trouble raising funds for Naya Health, which is her company, just because, it was awkward explaining breastfeeding to male VCs. People constantly told her she should pitch to women. She eventually did scrape together a seed round and launched her product at the end of last year with a great viral video, which is called If Men Breastfed. I highly recommend it. It's on YouTube and on Facebook. It's very funny. And she sold her first run of 1,000 pumps, which is all she had money to manufacture, in the first 3 weeks. No marketing, just on the back of word of mouth, the video, and some great press that she got. But she still can't raise a Series A because people are saying, well, it's hardware, it's not a very big market, etc. So she actually just went to Kickstarter. She's got 3 days left on her campaign, so if you can help to promote it, we'd be very grateful. So just search.
Remind us the name again, the name of
So it's Kickstarter Janica Alvarez, if you search for that, or
Janica.
Kickstarter Smart Bottle, you'll find it. It's a smart bottle that goes with the breast pump. So I think women are increasingly turning it to alternatives to the VC model. And I'm not even convinced that VC is always the best way of funding some of these startups. So.
As a new mom, I have to say, please thank her for leading innovation in this space. And everyone check out that campaign.
Yeah,
We're going to turn to audience questions in just a minute here. So please get ready if you have one. Before we do that, I'm going to ask you, Obi, just quick rapid fire, a little more get to know you. Tell us, who have been your main influences?
My parents. So both my parents in Berlin, where I grew up, my natural parents who were academics and liberals. But then I went to the US when I was 16 as an exchange student, and my host parents were completely different, working class family, highly conservative. So that's where I first learned tolerance for different people who thought differently. And I know the people who voted for Trump because it's my family and friends in upstate New York. So.
What's a book that you're reading right now, or maybe one you would recommend to our audience?
Okay. I always have multiple unfinished books on the go. So currently I'm reading Adam Grant Originals. I love him. Great tech talk, great book. I'm reading Herminia Ibarra, who is an INSEAD professor. And this is a book I've actually finished. It's called Think Like a Leader, Act Like a Leader. It's great for women. Like, it's all about like faking it until you make it. I highly recommend it, and how to build your networks before you think you need the network. And then the third one is an obscure German book. It's called Cox, and it's about the passage of time. It's about a watchmaker, a clockmaker that's asked by the Emperor of China to come to his court and build him an extraordinary clock that can measure the difference of time, how it feels much slower at the end of your life than at the beginning of your life when it's very fast.
It's going by too fast. Tell me what's next on your travel bucket list?
I'd love to hike Half Dome and then one day maybe climb it. That's more ambitious.
What are 3 apps you can't live without?
3 apps. Gmail, WhatsApp, because all my friends in Europe are on it, and my family actually. And I guess calendar, because it runs my life.
Touche. Do we have questions from our audience? Yes. In the back?
Hi, do you think about taking on racism or sexism as a moonshot?
Do it. Think about what? Taking non-racism and non-sexism as a moonshot?
Racism or sexism as a moonshot.
As a moonshot.
Oh, taking it out. Yeah, I mean, I think it's actually, I feel like diversity as a whole is possibly the most important moonshot of all, because it's the thing that underlies everything, right? Like, if we create more equality, it will unlock so much talent that we can probably solve all the other problems in the world.
Hi, I have a question over here.
Yes.
I don't know where you are. Wave. Hi.
Hi, so as a female would-be entrepreneur with zero experience in startups, do you have any recommendations on where to even just start finding people to mentor and all of that?
Where you find people? Okay. So there's a whole bunch of, there's conferences, there's networks, there's incubators. Mary can probably give you a list more of like specific ones.
Two organizations I highly recommend anyone get involved with in any city. One is Startup Grind, and the second is Startup Weekend, who's part of Techstars. So find your local Startup Grind chapter, get involved. They have monthly meetups. They have an amazing conference every year here in the Bay Area. The second is participate in a Startup Weekend. It's a 54-hour weekend hackathon. 33% of teams actually continue on with the startup they created, but much more importantly is the experience and the co-founders potentially that you meet. So built-in communities, but I also think events like this and meetups.
Yeah.
Maybe one final audience question we have? Great.
Right.
Hi, my name is Kaushiki and I'm from the UC Berkeley School of Information. One question that basically I had during the entire conversation was like how inclusivity actually benefits a workplace. Like till now it's being talked about like it's morally the right thing to do or it's socially the right thing to do. But I feel it's much more than that. Like it actually helps bring out really good products out into the world. and helps the world change. So maybe if you could give some examples around that, I think it'll be.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, just to be clear, yes, I think it's a moral issue, but it's most of all, it's like the thing that's going to shift it is when people treat it as a business issue, right? So I think right now, diversity work is seen as like by some leaders as like something that's a little bit annoying, right? So my goal at X was to first make it cool. So we have like cool diversity events that people want to show up at, but the ultimate goal has to be to make it business as usual. And that's only when people understand that it actually will make their products and their businesses better. So I'll give you one example, which is not a gender line one, which was Project Wing. The engineers were super excited about a use case of using drones to deliver defibrillators to heart attack victims, right? It was like turning drones into a life-saving machine as opposed to a killing machine. And we had user experience researchers and a marketing person who was on my team who dug into like the use case specifically, and they measured how long it took people after they got the delivery from the drone to use the defibrillator. And they figured out that it took them 6 minutes to understand how to use the thing. And within 7 minutes, the ambulance is there anyway. So even if you deliver it by drone, you're not saving people's lives. And so it's just that different perspective of like not looking at it from a technology point of view of like how can we build this, but like why are we even doing it and are we solving the right problem, that completely shifted that project. And now they're doing food delivery. Because that's a good first use case. That's actually truly useful because people do want hot, fresh food delivered. So it's, you know, it's absolutely important that you have this kind of friction of different kind of viewpoints at the table. Otherwise, like if everyone thinks the same, like you end up with products that don't work. And I think the Valley is littered with examples of that.
Final parting thought, Obi. We have so many community leaders, tech leaders in this room. What is one piece of parting advice that you have for them when thinking about how to create a diverse and inclusive future through your Moonshot lens?
Right. Well, first of all, I'd say you need resilience. You know, it's a long, hard slog. Like moonshots don't happen overnight, and diversity can feel very dispiriting. You know, when the memo came out at Google earlier this year, I think many of us were like, "Oh my God, it just feels like we're starting kind of at ground zero again," right? So I'd say like resilience is super important, and like I feel like we are making progress. It's just slow. And it's painful, and it will continue to be slow and painful, and it will continue to take a while, right? And then the second thing is I think we need a perspective shift, which is we so often we talk about diversity still along these traditional lines, right? Like we talk about men versus women, we talk about, you know, LGBT versus like straight people. And I just don't think it's helpful. I think we have to shift the conversation to thinking about inclusive behaviors that actually would benefit everyone, like whichever group you define yourself at, right? Like if you feel like you're in the minority because you're conservative, for instance, you know, that's a valid viewpoint. Like I had a really interesting conversation with a white male engineer on my team who said, I grew up very poor, you know, I worked my way through college, so I find it very upsetting when people say I'm privileged because I'm a white male software engineer, right? Like, I don't feel privileged, I've never felt privileged in my life. And then I had this Asian woman sort of speaking back to him and saying like, well, you know, I grew up not poor, my parents paid for my college, but I was the only woman in my computer science class, right? And they suddenly sort of realized that both of them felt like they were both sort of victims and a minority, but they're also allies. And I think until we redefine inclusion, cutting across those traditional divisive lines, like we're not going to make progress. And we can't keep asking the white men to support every other group. It just it's backfiring, and it's not going to make progress, I don't think.
Resilience and behavior shifts.
Yeah.
Thank you very much,
Thank you.
Obi Felton. Thank you.